I've got my Brittany mic today, so I don't need it. Right. Hi. So I'm here today to speak a little bit about React Native, as quite a few of you were interested in hearing a bit more about it. We've not had too many talks on it. So I decided to focus on React Native and some of the stuff that's happened since it's been launched, some of the interesting things you might not be aware of if you weren't following it previously. You've been asking for quite a few of these talks. Unfortunately, you've ended up with me. You have to put up with that, I'm afraid. So, just a quick caveat or excuse. If you don't know too much about React Native, this is not really an intro talk. There were quite a few of those previously, and there's lots of good ones on YouTube, etc. So I'll go at a fairly high level, but not really explain much about what React Native is, because by now, most of you are probably aware of what it is and what it does and why it's important and cool. So actually, in practice, this talk is more like a few cool things that I found in React Native that have not really been spoken about previously. So hopefully you'll agree that they're cool and not boring. One thing that I thought was quite important to mention is just how much has happened with React Native since it was been open sourced. So it was open sourced in January. At the time, it was quite alpha. It was a little bit unstable. A very cool idea, and obviously being used quite heavily by Facebook, but it did have its problems. Frankly, it's just difficult to keep up with the pace of change on React Native at the moment. There's been nearly 2,000 commits of all sorts of things, and every day Facebook are pouring out more features, and lots of the community have got involved as well. So that's really exciting to see. So since it's come out, we've seen some really cool enhancements like Chrome debugging, so you can use all of the proper Chrome dev tools, which Christopher Shadow originally demoed at the React conference in January, but we didn't actually get for a little while. So we've had the Chrome debugger. We've had just recently inspect element, just in the same way as you can inspect element in Chrome. You can now inspect all of the styles of your React Native components and stuff, which is really useful and quite cool to get up to scratch with a bigger code base, kind of finding out where things all fit together, especially if you're not very good at Flexbox like me, so just getting used to it. There's also some quite cool performance debugging tools and a load of work on animations and stuff. So it's come a really long way, and it's quite exciting to see something with so much traction behind it. So just thought that was worth mentioning. So I wanted to talk mainly about some two quite cool features that I've found that nobody's really talked about previously. The first one of which being ES6 and 7 compatibility, which has got a lot better in the past few weeks, which is something I'll cover again in a minute, and continuous delivery, which again I'll talk about a bit later, but it's something that we don't have at all on mobile most of the time, and something that React Native lets you achieve effectively, which is really quite exciting. So I'll focus first of all on some ES6 and 7 features. So in order to not make this too dry and theoretical, I thought I'd make an example app, just so I can kind of demo some of the features in context. I'm not very creative, so I thought I could make a London React Meetup app for all of you guys. Apparently, we've heard that it's quite difficult to get a ticket for this before they sell out, so I thought it'd be nice to have an app that would kind of summarize when the next talk's going to be, where it's going to be, when we're releasing tickets, and maybe notify you, etc. So it's a rubbish little app, but it will demonstrate some of the things I want to talk about quite nicely. So I'll give you a little preview. I don't know how small this is going to be. We'll see. Exciting. Right, well, as you can see, I'm not a fan of colour. Is that small? It's quite small, but unfortunately I can't zoom this in, so you'll have to put up with it. So, as I said, it's not going to set the world alight. It's a... one sec, sorry. It's a very simple React Native app. It just demonstrates some like very basic stuff about what's happening at the meetup, the date in which it's happening, the venue, and it gives you kind of a little synopsis of each of the talks. And you can click on one of the talks and find out a bit more about it. This seems quite egocentric to use my talk as an example. But it will give you, a synopsis of the talk and just a couple of details at the bottom about, you can go to the speaker's Twitter page. You probably shouldn't go to mine because it's just awful. Or their GitHub page or something, just as a little example. So there's not like a great deal that's super interesting to see here, but one thing that you'll probably notice is that it looks like a native app. It looks like most apps that you'll see on iOS, and that is due to the fact that it's wrapped up in this Navigator iOS component, which is kind of the bit you can see where that gives you these like sweeping animations, and you can click back at the top and you have this kind of nav bar and stuff. So you get all of that stuff for free with React Native. It's just like really simple to plug in, and there's just like 2 basic views that I'm routing between. So that's all pretty nice. Also, you have a bit of native integration. So if I click on the venue, for example, that'll open in the native Maps app and kind of open out on Facebook where we are. Obviously, that's not that useful for you guys because you actually made it. And then at the bottom, we have down here, this is really small, so you probably can't see, but this fetches from the Meetup API how many people have said that they're attending. So it's just a basic count of I fetched that from the Meetup API and just display the number there. So not super exciting, but bear with me. Back to the slides for a minute. So one thing that's interesting about this app, I should also mention the app is open source. So I'll give you the link at the end, and if any of you fancy contributing and making it not rubbish, then that would be appreciated. So the app is completely written in ES6 and 7 using like a lot of quite nice modern features. And that kind of comes back to one of the core principles of React Native, as where I think that a lot of the internal team at Facebook see React Native as more of an experimental kind of framework, a place to try out like lots of new ideas, and obviously, because they're not limited by browsers, we can kind of implement whatever we like there. There's all kinds of ideas about animation APIs and all sorts of things like that that might make the web much better. So it's kind of being used as a test bed for that sort of thing. But onto the ES7 subject. So just recently, in the past couple of weeks, probably 3 or 4 weeks, React Native itself has a packager which will effectively like Webpack or Browserify or something that takes all of your source code, packages it up, minifies it, bundles it, makes all the modules resolve, etc., and gives you it all in one big script file. So we just call that the React Native packager. Just recently, it was using JS Transform, which is kind of an internal Facebook, well, not internal, it was open source, but a Facebook tool to transform ES6, like kind of a subset of ES6 that they were using internally, into ES5, etc., just to make it compatible. But JS Transform had its limitations, and thankfully we have very good tools now, like Babel. So a couple of weeks ago, the React Native packager switched to using Babel, so you can now write ES7 and beyond in your React Native apps, and it all works quite nicely. So it requires a little bit of setup, which I'll go into in a sec. But that means that we've got really nice stuff like template strings and modules and classes and stuff, which is more the ES6 stuff. But then and arrow functions. But we have a few nice features of ES7, like async await and decorators as well, which I'll go into a bit more. So the good thing about a lot of this stuff is it's actually really simple to set up. It's just, if any of you have used Babel and Webpack before, it's really similar to that. You have a .babelrc file, which is like a JSON document, which will basically opt you into a lot of the more experimental features in the new framework. So I'll just show you what that looks like. Thankfully, Atom's not crashed on me. I read on Twitter that Atom is actually short for a terabyte of memory, which I thought was quite interesting. Babel RC. There we go. So here we just have, it's not very exciting, we just have a list of the transforms that are whitelisted. By default, React Native is quite conservative in what it uses because we don't want to use a load of half-implemented or kind of not fully spec'd out features yet. But you'll see that I've added a few features in here, like ES7 class properties, async functions, decorators, etc. So it's all very easy to wire up. And you just, you can create a Babel RC file and restart the packager, and everything just starts working and transpiling into ES5. So by far, my favorite feature in all of JavaScript, in all of ES7 and everything upcoming is async await. I'm sure many of you have probably seen this. But in case you haven't, it basically solves callback hell. So, you know, we had the phase of lots of callbacks that are a little bit hard to manage. Then we had promises that have come in as kind of a bit of a stopgap. Actually, conceptually a lot nicer, but in terms of the syntax, don't end up being that amazing. And you end up having to re-implement parts of the language. So async await kind of comes along and takes away tons of the pain points around writing asynchronous code. So just as a quick summary, if you've not quite seen it before. Async await lets you write functions like this. So you declare a function to be asynchronous, and that will allow you, within the function, to await. And awaiting something, it will take a promise or something else that conforms to roughly that API and actually block the function, but in a non-blocking fashion. So effectively, it's like just syntax sugar for promises. And so there's a few more subtleties to it than that. But one of the really nice things about async await, first of all, is it solves this kind of pyramid of doom where you're going across with like registering lots and lots of callbacks. But it also allows you to finally use the actual language features again, which you wouldn't think was worthy of getting excited about, but apparently it is. So we can now use try and catch again. We can put these within a loop and things won't break. We can do all sorts of things. It just brings first-class support effectively for asynchronous functions, and it makes everything much more declarative about. For example, you can't await something unless you've declared that your function is async in the first place. So this kind of where you switch a function from being synchronous to being async, and you have to change everything upstream to add callbacks. This effectively in Babel it wouldn't even compile if you didn't do that. So you declare a function async and you have to await these functions. So React Native bundles the fetch API, which is now in Chrome stable, I think, which exports a kind of promise-based API to make these requests. So the Meetup example that I put in, this is the actual code for that, which runs in like component did mount or something, and effectively just fetches the number of people that RSVP'd. So async await is amazing. You should definitely try it out. It can do really nice things for your code, make it a lot shorter, and just much less error-prone to write asynchronous code. And it's something you can take advantage of in React Native very easily. Just on the same subject, this might look like gibberish to you if you've not seen much Objective-C before, but React Native makes it really easy to interface with native code. And you can write effectively a native method that you then export across the JavaScript bridge, and you can kind of talk between the across the JavaScript bridge. And everything on the JavaScript bridge is asynchronous. So async await can be used really heavily in React Native. But you can use this RCT export method macro, and it will actually bring in, it will ensure that your Objective-C code actually exports a promise-like API, which means that you can just await any of these features. So if you wanted to use this, for example, reading a file, you can just await this function name, and then it will all block and work properly. So that's really nice, and you can use that across React Native with all of the APIs it supports now. So I'm quite a fan. I don't know if you can tell. So on to another thing. ES7 decorators is something that I wasn't really aware of up until very recently. They some cynics kind of say that they solve a problem that classes introduce in the first place, and that is the fact that, I don't know if many of you using ES6 classes in your React code, you'll know that you now can't use mix-ins anymore. And there's a lot of places where Facebook say mix-ins are bad on the whole, and yes, they definitely are, just a weird form of multiple inheritance, but they can be useful in some scenarios. Thankfully, ES7 decorators bring in a kind of alternative to that, a way of bringing in different features to your classes. I'll just use an example. So the kind of like functional name for this, I suppose, that I've seen people banding about recently is higher order components. So that is the suggestion that effectively you would take a React component that you've written, which would be an ES6 class. You will add a decorator to the component, and you'll receive back a higher order component, which is effectively the same component decorated with some new behavior. So the simplest example, so here is what it looks like to use one of those decorators. You use this @ syntax above a class, and so I decided to use one that everybody would be quite familiar with, probably, the pure render mixin that was previously bundled with React, which now you kind of can't use from ES6 classes. You would be able to declare a pure render decorator, and it would enhance your class and kind of define some methods on it. This one is super simple, so all it defines is should component update. And so if you're not familiar with the pure render mixin, it is a way of declaring that your component only depends on props. So it would never have to re-render unless its props change. Effectively, it's stateless. So it can lead to like massive performance improvements in your React apps if you have a really deeply nested hierarchy or something. So I'll just show you what a decorator actually looks like in terms of its implementation. So ignore all the ones above, but effectively this one right at the bottom here, the pure render component. First of all, we just assert that there's a React component that was correctly passed to this, but then we receive an instance of the component, and then we can patch the prototype of the component to add new features to it or modify existing features. So here I'm just adding a new method called should_component_update, and I'm using the exact method that comes straight out of React add-ons. And so I'm just patching that feature onto the class, but I'm doing it without using mix-ins or inheritance. So this is a way of bringing all those features back to ES6 classes. As a slightly more complex example, but a bit of a stupid one, I wasn't feeling very creative at this point, you could tag a component with the debug decorator, and it would console.log your props and your state every single time the render function got called. So here we're taking a component, again asserting that it's a React component, and we're patching the render method by saving it and effectively wrapping it up. So we apply the original render method here, and we just add in some logging for the props and the state of the component. So not something that you'd use in practice because you just add console.log to the top of your render method, but it shows that you might be doing this all the way across your app and have lots of different features you want to bring in, things like for immutability and stuff that you can just bring into any class. So they can be really nice for your code. They're a little bit difficult to write in the first place, but effectively the fact that we're taking a component, modifying it, and returning you a new component, there's a fancy word for that, and it's higher order component, so I've learned in the last week. So then there's one more feature that I'm actually very interested in, and probably is the most exciting one, I think. And that is continuous deployment. So I didn't quite understand just how bad this was. I don't do much native development, to be honest. I've always developed stuff for the web, mainly. And so I wrote this React London app the other day, and I was like, OK, right, I'm just going to throw that on the App Store. And I know that there's a review process for it, and there's been a lot of complaints about it in the past. But based on some preliminary Googling and some not very reliable sites, I found out that the average time to review an iOS app is 10 days. So the way that I see that, if I mess something up, which I do all the time, I have to wait 10 days to correct it. And perhaps, for smaller app updates, you'd wait a bit less time than that. But that's just something we're not used to on the web at all. So thankfully, just after React Native was launched, probably 1 or 2 months afterwards, Apple actually have relaxed some of the rules on their hot code loading policy. And so they say in their docs, an application may not download or install executable code, a load of boring stuff in the middle. The only exception to the foregoing is scripts and code downloaded and run by Apple's built-in WebKit framework or JavaScript core. So they added those two words when they last revised this. And it kind of fits in with the fact that in iOS 8, there was a bit more of a JavaScript core became more of like a public API, something they were promoting a bit more. And clearly, they're noting the fact that if you are running your code inside JavaScript core, it's effectively a sandbox where you can't do too much destructive stuff. And so they're now finally allowing you to download source code and run it inside of JavaScript core. So this is something that you could do if you had an app written in PhoneGap or something, but that comes with its own set of problems. So this means that we can deploy our code, a new app update, provided that we don't want to change any native code, which is normally not necessary in React Native unless you want to bring in a load of new native features or link in some libraries. We bring down that 10 days to like 1 or 2 minutes, to the point where we'd be able to push out that bug fix or new features or whatever to every user of our app, which is just insanely better. So the process looks like this. I decided to build this into the React Native London React app, mostly because it's not very good at the moment. So if you submit a pull request to the repo, I can merge it and it will just be deployed. And Apple haven't actually reviewed the app yet, but I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that it doesn't break any of their rules anymore. So we should be able to get away with this. So the process goes like this. You ship an app with the React Native bundle. So there's a command called React Native bundle, which takes all of your source code, wraps it up in a big JavaScript file, minifies it, etc., ready to be launched onto the App Store. But there's a little bit of extra code. I'm terrible at Objective-C, but I did manage to do this. And when you launch the app, we will check whether there's a new version of the bundle. And if there is, download and save it. And we'll then boot the app. So the step in the middle, it can fail, so we can be offline at the time, and we'll just use the previous bundle. So I'm going to demo it, maybe. We'll see how it goes. But the idea being that I'm going to commit something to master of my React Native repo. Circle CI, which I'm using for continuous integration, should pick up the change, build it, run the React Native bundle command, and push that bundle to S3. Then, when I next launch the app in the simulator, I should see my new changes. And if I don't, feel sorry for me. Right, so where's my terminal? Here we go. Can we see that? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to make a new branch. Demo. I'm going to... I don't trust Atom for this. I'm going to open my big bundle, which at the moment has everything in it. I've not split it down into different components. And I'm going to do something really boring, which is to make an alert. So I'm going to alert iOS.alert. And I'm going to alert hello React Meetup. Don't forget my semicolon. And then we'll hang. I'm going to commit that. Don't break I'm going to go to my repo. Here we are. Open a little pull request. Don't break is a good title. I'm going to wait. So, and I'm going to merge with caution. In fact, I need to open the app. So at the moment, here is the app. If I quit it and reopen it, come on. Unbelievable. 2 secs. Not a problem. Can I just mention? Oh dear. Why is that big? Command 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, thanks very much. Learned something new. Victor, you told me that wasn't possible. So, thankfully, I've been saved. So, no alert when we open the app. Oh yeah, just one point. I'm very excited about the fact that soon you're going to be able to develop React Native apps without touching Xcode. So I've been promised. Thanks to Facebook's Nuclide internal IDE, which will kind of interface with a lot of the Objective-C build tools and mean that you don't have to touch it. If you've not touched Xcode before, you're doing well. Like, endeavor to never touch it. It's just terrible. Anyway, bad-mouthing Apple. So I'm going to merge my pull request, and we're going to hope and pray. If I pop over to Circle CI, my build is now running. And so we've got about a minute to wait, so talk amongst yourselves. So I'll just kind of talk you through the process of this. It's like super simple. We have, where's a terabyte of memory? Come back. Circle CI. So it's super simple. We install all of our NPM packages. We install the React Native client and the AWS client. And then we run our tests, which of course I've written loads of for this sample app. I've bundled the app, and by minifying it, it puts it into production mode, which starts some kind of performance optimizations. And then if we're on the master branch, I'm going to copy that bundle, and I'm going to push it up to S3. So none of that's happened yet, which is great. So it's installed my dependencies, etc. So the bundle that it produces is only like 1.2 meg or something, which is actually quite impressive. I found out recently, which is a bit of a weird fact, that the React Native apps should be much, much smaller because the actual JavaScript source code ends up as a compile target being much, much smaller than the equivalent Objective-C, which is quite interesting. Oh, there we go. What should we do in the meantime? So there are a couple more fancy features that I was going to demo of ES7, but I thought it'd be a bit much. One of which is the bind operator, which was actually very interesting. It's you can now, we used to be a huge fans of LiveScript, and in LiveScript you used to be able to say you'd have like a collection of things, and you'd be able to use this kind of arrow syntax here, and the pipe operator they used to call it, and you could say like map through this collection, and then you could filter it, etc. So in ES7, it's one of the like really early proposals, but you can now do something equivalent to this, which map and filter are crap examples because you can do that anyway with a dot operator, but you could put in any function here, and it will let you like kind of compose these functions together rather than writing them like map, filter, any function, etc., which is a bit crap and hard to read. Anyway, a little segue. Here we go. So apparently we've deployed. So at the moment I have to exit the app properly. And then at the moment I boot the app. Oh, nightmare. All right, well, it didn't work. I'm going to do it again. They're saying do it again. I'll do it again. Da, da, da. No, all right, fine. Feel sorry for me. But imagine, I mean, it doesn't really matter, does it? You can take my word for it. Imagine that came up with an alert. That would have been impressive. Let's do one more. Let's pretend that it worked. Still not going to. All right, fine. Take my word for it. Try it out. It's really cool. Hopefully, Apple approve my app, and hopefully, some of you put in some pull requests, and it might not be crap in future. Just one more interesting thing before I go. Yesterday or the day before, Facebook announced that they've released the Facebook Ads Manager, which, okay, not deserving of applause, but so Facebook Ads Manager was built in React Native. It was the first React Native app that they launched in general onto the App Store. It's now been released for Android on the App Store, or whatever it's called, Google Play Store. So you can take that as a sign that the Android version is coming very, very soon. So it's quite an exciting place to be. It's a very cool project, and it's moving very fast. So hopefully that was mildly useful. And if I can find my slides, I can't. Da, 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 da. Wow. There we are. Thanks. We're done.
Thanks, Joe.
The ordeal is over.
The demo gods hate you.
Yeah.
So has anyone got any questions? We've got these funky new microphones. So put your hand up and we'll throw a microphone at you. You just have to catch it, and you hold it quite close to your mouth because they're quite...
So can everyone hear me? Cool. So when generating those updates, can this Facebook magic generate just a diff? So say if you add a line, it could generate a diff of the JavaScript. Can it do it now?
That's quite an interesting point, actually. There's no reason why you couldn't, yeah. Presumably, you might be able to do it with like a standard like Unix diffing tool, and you'd need to somehow apply that diff, and I'm not entirely sure. There's probably like an Objective-C library that you could use to do that, but yeah, it's entirely possible to do that. And that's actually a really good point, because most app updates to like Twitter or Facebook or something end up being massive, which you normally don't want to do over the air on people's measly data connections. So yeah, it should be much more practical to do that in future. These look dangerous.
Thanks. Are you guys at Red Badger already working on React Native apps for client projects, or is this still something you're experimenting with?
So it's basically something we're experimenting with and trying to shove into client projects wherever we can, because it makes them much more interesting. So at the moment, we have nothing, like we don't have a client project that's actually using this all the time, so it's more of like a spare time activity. But there's certainly some things on the radar that we might start using React Native for, which would be very interesting. And I'll hold my hand up to be on that project.
Cool.
Would it be possible to develop for iOS without OS X?
Ah, interesting. I don't really know too much about that because, as I said, before I started with React Native, I didn't do that much iOS development. I tend to think not. I know that Nuclide and stuff is aiming to bridge the gap and like remove the dependency on Xcode, but I'm guessing that a lot of the tools still might only work on OS X, but I'm not really qualified to make that assumption, so.
Thank you.
Don't know.
Anyone else? No. Okay, thank you very much, Joe.
Cheers.
Brilliant.